take it that's working, right? Yeah, great, thanks. So as I said, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start with some rather basic remarks. The light is fading here rather quickly. This is not characteristic California weather for late October. It's overcast and cooling down. So a light might go on sort of when the light gets too dark. So I'm going to start with some basic sort of data just as a kind of touch point for, I guess, the discussions. Worldwide infections with COVID-19 are upwards of 40 million already, 8 million of which, so 20% of which, and growing at upwards of 50,000 a day, are US-based infections, so it's 20%, even though the population of the US is only 4% of the global population. And worldwide deaths are above 1 million, 1,000,001, and US deaths are about a fifth of that. So sort of as the last presidential debate is getting going, I can say that, you know, the US is once again the elephant, the sign of the Republican Party, after all, is the elephant in the room, although that's probably doing a disservice to elephants. So maybe I'll just call it the monster in the room at this point and sort of come back to some consideration of that at the end. There are ethno-racial disparities almost everywhere, but certainly in populations that have been known to fuel racial distinction. So, you know, you can see from these numbers that the rate of infection of whites is lower than the rate in the population in Britain and the US. In the US, the rate of infection and deaths got up to about a third in total, even though 13% of the population. But you can see that, you know, Asian Americans are lower than the percentage of the population, having to do with economic reasons and so on. And it's interesting to contrast this, of course, with Africa, which has fared rather well, contrary to all the predictions of how it would fare in global with COVID-19. So Senegal is ranked third best in terms of rates of infection and death, behind the likes of Korea, South Korea, and Taiwan, and I think above New Zealand, right? It's done remarkably well, again, for reasons time permitting, I'll come back to. And then again, you see in a state like Louisiana, right, the conditions that are leading, the underlying conditions, comorbidities as it's called, that are leading, you know, to the overwhelming condition of Blacks. But, you know, those global disparities, I mean, particularly between Africa and the global North, for example, Western Europe and North America, is you can see that it's manufactured, right? It's not a natural condition for anybody who might think it's a natural condition. It's a function of the kinds of economic and social disparities and distinctions that are built into the very structure of the society. Again, we'll come back to that. So now lockouts, what Agamben calls a politics of exclusion or eviction, and lockdowns, quarantining, a politics of incarcerating containment, that distinction that Foucault also draws historically, have made the world far more reliant on digital technologies. I mean, we're experiencing it in real time now, for social interaction, work, learning, news, recreation, consumption, emergency connectivity, and the like. And you can see just from this image the kind of network connectivity that links people, and where it's thicker and where it's thinner, and where that kind of connectivity is enhancing and enlarging the kind of domain of privilege over those who are less so, right? So a driving question is how this has changed in the long term in a structural way the conditions of being in relation as such. So Agamben makes the argument that we've given up on social relation as a consequence, and there's impending fascism built into his argument. And one wants to ask, whether social relation is just a natural condition in that kind of way. I mean, social relation itself is socially massaged historically and contemporarily. Right? The first thing to say is that these shifts predated have been exacerbated by the pandemic. So they're not simply produced by the pandemic, but they factor in to the way in which the pandemic has been experienced and sort of taken over life in some sense. So capitalism, I'm going to shift to some reflections now on political economy, and this will be quick in the interest of time, but I think crucial. Capitalism is scaled from the production line through mass production to sequenced waves of managerialism, service, and financial capital. I mean, you can look at Zuboff's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, for example, to get a sense of this, right? Even though I have quite deep, as you'll see in a minute, quite deep differences with her. If you look at Allen Ginsberg's Howl, and I'll leave you to read through this as I'm talking, there's a sense in which he's sort of capturing the anger, the howl at the kinds of conditions that the history of capitalism have produced. And this passage at the end ends with the imagination shaped and constrained by political economy. And that too is an important point, right? Again, borne out in some comments to come. What emerges out of this is that consumption or commodity capitalism produces economic value at the point of commodity and service exchange. That is, that profit, surplus value, right, is enacted at the very moment of exchange by political, if not necessarily also symbolic or semiotic value, in the way in which Ginsberg at the end of this passage in Howl is gesturing at. Welfare capitalism, so this is consumption capitalism. I mean, on the one side is the Warhol silkscreen, of course, and on the other is a porcelain image of Mao. I have a photograph actually from Beijing of myself standing on a pink version of this, but I thought it would be too much to show. This porcelain little statuette is called the premium porcelain statuette of Mao. And you can see the way in which commodity capitalism sort of enacts a kind of fetish almost of a figure like this. Out of this emerges, just in terms of a quick history, welfare capitalism that sort of starts at the end of the 1920s, ramps up in the 1930s, and lasts until about the 1980s, doesn't altogether disappear, but becomes occluded or eclipsed in a minute. And of course, welfare capitalism is a capitalism that sees itself caretaking for its citizens, the state caretaking for its citizens, and excluding or precluding anybody who's not citizens. And in the global north, those citizens are taken to be white, right? And exactly at the moment that the welfare state sort of becomes more diverse, that moment is also the moment of the resistance to the welfare state, as we'll come to see now. So the welfare state is turned prudence from a virtue to a sin, rewarding the imprudent with the wealth of the people willing to work for their own futures. And it's, those who are not willing to work for their own futures, this quote goes on, not here, are called explicitly savages, right? So the undertaking of the emergence of the neoliberal state has as its object the undoing of the welfare state. Neoliberalism, of course, is the financialization of everything, right? Everything has financial or monetary value in terms of a kind of monetary cost-benefit calculus, a privatizing and individualizing of everything and all experience, a privatizing as well of responsibility, a dehistoricizing of the conditions that produce the very moment that we're in. So a cutting away from the historical production of those conditions, where value increasingly is driven through platform creations, so platform capitalism, and is experiential in a way I'll explain just now. This is, of course, Google, Amazon, Apple, and Facebook as the provision of the platforms that are now shifting not out of neoliberalization, but extending it into a new modality. Experiential capitalism or event and experiential capitalism, I think, is important, develops out of platform capitalism. The point is to extend the kind of production of surplus value by extending the experience and extending the eventfulness. You see this, for example, in going on cruises, the very condition that that ramped up the pandemic. You see it in church services. You see it in even conferences, but certainly in festivals of various kinds. You can go on concerts and so on, where it's not just the experience, that the immediacy of the experience, which is producing surplus value, but the entire industry around it, whether it's selling T-shirts or CDs or extending the experience, right, or all kinds of mementos, and even being reminded a year later on Facebook of the anniversary of it, right, and so on and so forth. So the experience extends the possibility of producing ongoing profit out of the very experience itself. And what you get emerging out of this, as Shoshana Zuboff argues, is a form at the beginning of the century with the dot-com bust, the shift to surveillance capitalism, what she calls surveillance capitalism. I will mark by something else, where, in the move is from these platforms like Netscape and then Google being search engines to being the sites of revenue generation through advertising, extensive advertising. And what emerges, so there's a 4,000% increase from 2001 to 2004 in the profitability of those companies, of those digital companies like Google and eventually Facebook and so on, that emerge out of this. So what you get as a consequence, I mean, Zuboff's argument, which is actually a quite conventional liberal argument, is the radical curtailment of autonomy, free will, and privacy, right? Taken as universal values. So themselves having, in her reading, no historical reading of the way in which those values get both formed and reformed. The latest and most dramatically profitable form is more intrusive by far than any previous mode. Online user data surplus, are collected on a massive scale through the ubiquitous embedding of cookies in browsers, as well as sensors and monitors in the general landscape. Together, they generate personal user navigated activity profiles on the basis of which subjects will be targeted commercially, economically, politically, even criminologically. No internet user, generally no one, even now as I speak, generally no one connected to or navigating any grid, digital or infrastructural, is immune. Personal, I mean, even in the built landscape, I mean, you're obviously being sensed at every kind of turn, right? Personal user and activity data are declared the private propriety products of the corporations and governments collecting them. And so, that sense of these platforms now becoming what I call the developers and purveyors of what I call, rather than surveillance capitalism, tracking capitalism with a hyphen, and not the tracking of capitalism, but a capitalism that tracks and generates its profitability and surplus through the pervasive tracking of everything and everyone under all conditions at all times, whether you're consuming stuff, whether you're interacting with others, whether it's family, whether it's friends, whether it's strangers, whether you're walking down the street, whatever you're doing, you are being tracked. I mean, the fact that you're carrying a cell phone around with you is tracking you, right? And is mapping your every engagement and relationality.
There's 4 minutes left.
Right. And so you can see that, I mean, even your employer is tracking you, right, when you're working at home in some sense, and what you're doing. Now, and of course, what the pandemic has done is to extend this condition of tracking. The very notion of tracking and tracing, right, is an extension of the technologies of possibility of tracking everybody at every moment. So there's a double viral takeover, hence my title, right? There's the viral takeover of the pandemic, and in a sense, through the pandemic, the extension of the viral takeover of digitality. What I call this is the technopticon in the technopolis, right? The way in which our lives are being extended into a kind of technopolis. We're living inside, right, the bubble of technology, and the technopticon is watching us. It's taken over from the panopticon. If platforming and its technologies of enablement, applications and amplifications of everything has fashioned what I call the technopolis, it has likewise developed the panopticon, as I say, into the technopticon. And so you get something like this, right? Digital humanities, just to finish this off, has both a technological and a critical conception. The technological is just an extension of what I've been talking about, right? I mean, one should not romanticize sort of what its engagement in this undertaking is. But there is a kind of critical digital humanities, if you want to put it in those terms, which is technologically obviously no panacea, but a way of engaging in the set of structures and enactments in critical sorts of ways. So I'm going to end just with some quick reflections on memory. Anthropomorphic memory, that is human memory, is made up of the recollection of pasts. While drawing on the bits of data in people's memory bank, such memory is not simply reducible to these data bits. It involves the recounting, the narratives composed to make sense of how those data fit together. You might say remembering the occurrence, that is a putting back together. There's a relation constitutive of human memory. As such, threading together registers of the past and their being made present, sometimes with embellishment, their representation to themselves and others. Memory in this mode, as Sean Bemba suggests, is constitutive of, at least in part, of what makes the human. It involves the calling up and sharing of histories that have shaped time and place, of slavery and colonialism, wars and genocides, without elevating any one in value over the others. Algorithmic memory, on the other hand, is quite static, right? The data and their operationalization are all there is. There's but a singularity to the plane of data qua data. It is not coincidental that we speak of algorithmic memory only in the singular, right? There are no happy data memories, right? There's just memory. There's no fraught data-driven memory. It's singular in that sense. It's machinic. Algorithmic reasoning, in contrast to the slower time of anthropomorphic memory, is constitutively disposed to futurity made present. So the future becomes the present at every instance. There's no future other than the future in the present. It's data being called up in the moment. So I think what I'll do, I mean, there's much more to be said about memory, but in the interest of time, I'll just end by saying that what the pandemic has done is confronted us with a dilemma, a kind of choice, right? I mean, the fact that the US has done so badly is a function of the fact that there's no what I call infrastructures of caretaking that shore up the engagement of each other in the US. They've been eroded, and especially in the last 4 years. But you know, if they were there before, they were sort of there bitterly. And those societies that have fared much better pandemically, from Seoul and New Zealand and Taiwan to Senegal, right, are those that have infrastructures of caretaking, whatever they are, built into the very social conditions of possibility. And it's that enacts the possibility of undertaking a way of getting out of this together. Maybe I'll just end there because I'm sure my time is up. Thank you very much.